They called for help, and the Deathworlders answered with fury. An HFY short story. The station orbiting the planet Vesa Prime had never known war. For 300 years, the Alos people had lived in peace, trading with their neighbors, studying the stars, and building cities that looked more like gardens than settlements. They were a gentle species, tall and slender, with soft gray skin and large dark eyes made for reading starlight. They had no armies worth the name. They had never needed one. That changed on the day the sky turned black with ships that did not belong to them. The invaders called themselves the Krath Dominion, and they came without warning, without demands, and without mercy. Their warships dropped out of hyperspace in a ring around Vesa Prime, blotting out the sun with their dark hulls. Within minutes, the first bombs fell on the coastal cities. Within an hour, half of the Alos fleet, small as it was, had been turned into drifting wreckage. Speaker Nel Tarek stood in the command chamber of the Alos Concord Council, watching the reports scroll past on the crystal screens. Her hands trembled, though her voice did not. "Casualties?" she asked. "Rising," said the officer beside her. His name was Austin, and he had never fired a weapon in his life. None of them had. The Krath are not stopping at military targets. They are burning the coastal towns. Fishing villages, schools. Nel Tarek closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had hardened inside her. "Send the signal," she said. "Which signal?" "All of them. Every frequency we have. The old beacon too, the one from the founding archives, the one we were told never to use unless there was nothing left to lose." Austin hesitated. "Speaker, that beacon reaches into human space. You know what the Great Assembly says about the humans. They are dangerous, unstable. A species born from a broken world, kept behind their border for good reason. They are the only ones close enough to reach us before the Krath finish what they started," Nel Tarek said. "Send it." The beacon went out into the dark, carried on old frequencies few in the galaxy still used. It carried images, burning towns, columns of refugees fleeing into the hills, the wreckage of ships that had never been built to fight. It carried a simple message, translated into 100 languages, by an automated system that had not been used in decades. "We are being destroyed. We have no weapons left. If anyone can hear this, please help us." It traveled for 3 days before it crossed the border into the quarantine zone, the invisible line the wider galaxy had drawn around a small, blue-green world called Earth. On Earth, and on the scattered human colonies beyond it, life went on as it always did, messy, loud, and full of arguments. It was in the middle of one such argument, in the underground command bunker beneath the city of Geneva, that the beacon's signal arrived. Fleet Commander Sarah Voss was not supposed to be in that meeting. She had been called in only because the Joint Colonial Defense Council could not agree on anything without at least one officer present who had actually served in combat, and most of the council had not. She sat near the back of the room, arms crossed, listening to 2 ambassadors argue about trade tariffs, when an aide burst through the door with a data slate clutched to her chest. "Sir, ma'am, everyone, you need to see this." The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, and the recording began to play. The room went silent as it watched. Burning buildings. A woman running with a child on her back, both of them coated in ash. A field of small bodies laid out beneath a scorched sky, too many of them too small. The message ended. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ambassador Reyes, the head of the council, cleared his throat. "This is not our sector," he said carefully. "The Alos are not signatories to any human treaty. The Great Assembly has made it very clear that human military action outside the quarantine zone is forbidden," Sarah said. It was the first thing she had said all meeting. "I know. I've read the treaty. I've read all 600 pages of it. I know exactly what it says about us." "Then you understand why we cannot simply—" "I understand that somewhere out there, right now, children are dying because nobody with the power to stop it is willing to break a rule written by people who are safe." Sarah stood. She was not a large woman, but something in the way she carried herself made people quiet down when she moved. "I understand that the galaxy locked us in a box 100 years ago because they were afraid of what we might do if we got loose. And I understand that the box has a door, and somebody just knocked on it and asked for help. Reyes rubbed his temples. The political fallout, Commander. If we send ships beyond the border, the other species will see it as proof of everything they already believe about us, that we're violent, reckless, a danger to galactic peace. Maybe we are, Sarah said quietly. But right now, on some world we've never heard of, there are people burying their children. And we have ships, we have soldiers, we have the ability to help, and the only thing stopping us is a piece of paper and the opinion of people who have never once had to bury anyone. Nobody in the room answered right away. Sarah let the silence sit. She had learned long ago that silence, held long enough, did more work than shouting ever could. It was Admiral Okoye, the oldest officer in the room, who finally spoke. He had fought in the colonial wars decades earlier, back when Earth had still been finding its footing among the stars. He had seen what happened when help came too late. "I'll take responsibility," he said. "Prep the Third Fleet. Commander Voss, you have command." Reyes started to protest, but Okoye held up a hand. "We can argue about treaties after the children stop dying. Move." 6 hours later, Sarah Voss stood on the bridge of the ESS Kestrel, the flagship of a fleet that had been assembled faster than any in human history. 22 ships, some of them barely finished, crewed by soldiers who had signed up for border patrol and instead found themselves heading into a war they had never trained for. Nobody complained. If anything, the mood on the ship was strange and electric, a mixture of fear and something closer to purpose. "Course laid in, Commander," said her navigator, a young man named Diaz who had never seen real combat. "Estimated arrival at Vesa Prime, 31 hours. "Send word ahead," Sarah said. "Let them know we're coming. And Diaz, tell the fleet to run silent until we're an hour out. I don't want the Krath to know what's headed their way, until it's too late for them to prepare." "Yes, Commander." Sarah stood at the viewport, watching the stars stretch as the ship entered faster than light travel. Somewhere behind her, on Earth, politicians would spend the next day arguing about what she had just done. Somewhere ahead of her, a species that had never seen a human before was about to meet one for the first time, in the worst moment of their history. She thought about the little girl in the video, running with her mother, coated in ash. She thought about the 600 pages of treaty that said humans were not allowed to care about anyone outside their own border. She thought about all the reasons the galaxy had for fearing what her species might become if it were ever let off its leash. "Let them be afraid," she murmured to herself. "Better afraid of us than dead because of someone else." Behind her, the fleet followed the Kestrel into the dark. 22 ships, carrying soldiers who did not yet know exactly what waited for them, but who understood, in the quiet way soldiers always do, that they were not turning back. Somewhere ahead, a dying world had called out into the void, certain that no one was listening. They were wrong. Someone had heard, and that someone was already coming, faster than anyone expected, angrier than anyone had planned for, and utterly unwilling to let one more child die, if there was anything at all they could do to stop it. Back on Vesa Prime, Speaker Nell Tarek did not know if her signal had reached anyone at all. She only knew that the sky above her capital was still full of Krath ships, and that every hour brought new reports of towns burning along the northern coast. She walked through the underground shelters that night, speaking to families who had lost everything in a single day, trying to offer comfort she did not fully believe herself. An old man grabbed her sleeve as she passed. "Speaker," he said, his voice cracking, "will help come? Is there anyone out there who cares what happens to us?" Nell Tarek knelt beside him, so their eyes were level. "I sent a call to a world we have never spoken to," she said honestly. "A world the rest of the galaxy fears. I do not know if they will answer. I do not know if they even can. But I know we had nothing left to lose by asking." The old man nodded slowly and said nothing more. Around them, children slept in the arms of parents who did not dare close their own eyes, listening to the distant thunder of Krath bombardment, rolling across the hills like a storm that refused to end. Above the planet, in the command ship of the Krath fleet, Warlord Drez Khan watched the burning world below with something close to boredom. He had conquered 11 systems in his career, and Vesa Prime was shaping up to be one of the easiest. The Allos had no real fleet, no real army, nothing but soft cities and softer people who wept and begged instead of fighting back. It was almost not worth the fuel it cost to bring his warships this far. "Continue the bombardment," he told his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered officer named Vex. "Once their capital surrenders, we take what we want and move on to the next system. I want this finished within the week." "And if no one comes for them?" Vex asked. "The Alos are not aligned with anyone strong enough to interfere." Drez Khan allowed himself something close to a smile. "No one is coming, Vex. That is the beauty of it. This is a quiet corner of the galaxy, far from anyone who matters. We could burn every city on this world, and no one beyond it would even notice for years." He had no way of knowing that, at that very moment, 22 human warships were already tearing through the dark toward Vesa Prime, carrying a commander who had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that someone was going to notice after all. The distress call had been answered. The Krath Dominion had no idea what that answer would cost them. 31 hours felt much longer when you did not know what you were flying into. Aboard the ESS Kestrel, the crew spent the journey the way soldiers always did, before a fight they did not fully understand, cleaning weapons that were already clean, checking systems that had already been checked, and talking too much about small things so they did not have to talk about the big one. Sarah Voss walked the length of the ship twice a day, stopping to speak with as many crew members as she could. She did not give speeches, she just listened, and let them see that she was not afraid, even on the moments when she was. "Commander," said Lieutenant Priya Anand, the Kestrel's chief tactical officer, as Sarah stopped by her station on the second day. "I've been running simulations on the Krath fleet, based on the sensor data the Alos sent us. Their ships are big, heavily armored, built for slow, grinding sieges, not fast engagements." "Meaning?" "Meaning they're built to fight people who don't fight back," Anand said. "Every tactical model I run assumes an enemy that tries to match their firepower straight on. That's not us. That's never been us." Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. "No, it isn't." Humanity had not become a spacefaring power by being the strongest or the most advanced. Every human alive carried, somewhere in their blood and their bones, the memory of a homeworld that had never once made survival easy. Ice ages, plagues, predators bigger and faster and hungrier than anything humans could outrun. Humanity had crawled its way to the top of its own food chain, not through brute strength, but through creativity, cooperation, and a refusal to accept that any fight was already lost. That same instinct had carried them into space, and it was the same instinct Sarah was counting on now. "Draw up 3 plans," she told Anand. "One assumes we can talk the Krath into leaving. One assumes we have to fight them fleet to fleet. And one assumes everything goes wrong and we have to improvise. Which one do you think we'll need?" "The third one," Sarah said. "It's always the third one." The Kestrel and its fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Vesa system just under an hour later, running dark exactly as Sarah had ordered. Even at that distance, the sensors painted a grim picture. Krath warships, dozens of them, surrounded the planet like a ring of dark teeth. Bright flashes bloomed across the planet's night side, each one a bomb falling on a city that could not fight back. "Options," Sarah said quietly. "We could try to hail the Krath commander," Anand offered. "Attempt negotiation before engaging." "We will." "But Anand, look at the bombardment pattern. They're not hitting military targets. They're hitting population centers. Whoever is in command down there isn't interested in talking." Sarah opened a channel anyway, because it was the right thing to try, even if she already knew what the answer would be. The Krath fleet did respond, eventually, with a broadcast that was translated a moment later by the ship's systems into a voice that was flat and mechanical. "Unknown fleet, you have entered a Krath conquest zone. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed alongside the vermin you came to protect." Sarah looked at the image on the screen, the burning planet, the endless dark ring of enemy ships, the casual cruelty in that single word, vermin. She thought of the little girl running through the ash in the video that had started all of this. "Reply," she said. "Tell them this, we are not withdrawing, and we are not vermin." She closed the channel before waiting for a response. Anand. "Signal the fleet. Formation Kestrel 3. We're going in." What followed was not the battle the Krath expected. Their warships, built for grinding down defenseless targets, turned to face the incoming human fleet with the lazy confidence of predators who had never once been challenged. They expected the newcomers to hold formation, to trade fire in slow, predictable exchanges the way every other species in the galaxy did. Instead, the human fleet scattered the moment it came within weapons range, breaking into a dozen small, fast-moving groups that struck from unexpected angles, pulled back before the Krath's heavier weapons could lock on, and struck again somewhere else. It looked less like a battle and more like a swarm of hornets attacking something far larger than themselves, chaotic, unpredictable, and impossible to pin down. On the surface of Vesa Prime, Speaker Neltarik stood on the balcony of the shelter she had been living in for 2 days, watching the sky. She had expected, if anything ever came at all, to see more warships arrive, and simply add themselves to the slow, grinding battle that had already been underway. What she saw instead made her breath catch. Streaks of light tore across the upper atmosphere, human fighters and small craft moving in patterns that made no sense to her, appearing and vanishing, striking and retreating before the larger Krath ships could even finish turning toward them. It should not have worked. By every rule of warfare Neltarik understood, it should not have worked at all. And yet, one by one, she watched Krath warships begin to burn. "What are they doing?" Asen asked beside her, his large dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and something close to horror. "I don't know," Neltarik admitted. "I've never seen anything fight like that." Aboard the Kestrel, Sarah watched the same battle unfold on her tactical display, calling adjustments as fast as she could think them. "Group 4, break off. They're baiting you toward their cruiser. Group 7, you've got an opening on their flank. Take it now." It was not clean. It was not elegant. 2 of the smaller human ships took heavy damage, pulling a maneuver that any other species would have called suicidal. But it worked, because the Krath had never fought an enemy willing to take that kind of risk, willing to treat every rule of safe warfare as something to be broken the moment it became useful to break it. By the time the first hour of real fighting ended, 4 Krath warships drifted dead in orbit, and the rest of their fleet had pulled back into a tighter, more defensive formation, clearly unsettled by an enemy that refused to behave the way enemies were supposed to behave. Warlord Drez Khan watched the reports come in with an expression that had shifted, in the space of an hour, from boredom to something far colder. "Who are these creatures?" he demanded. "Sensor logs identify them as human," Vex answered, his voice careful. "A species from a quarantined sector, considered a minor threat by the Great Assembly." "A minor threat just took out 4 of my ships in under an hour," Drez Khan said. "Reassess." Down on the surface, in the shelter beneath the Alos capital, Neltarik watched the Krath formation pull back for the first time since the invasion began, and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 days, to hope. She did not yet know what kind of species had come to answer her call. She only knew that whatever they were not what she expected, and they were not backing down. Somewhere above her, on the bridge of the Kestrel, Sarah Voss watched the retreating enemy formation and felt something settle in her chest. Not victory, not yet, but the first solid ground she had felt since this had all begun. "They're regrouping," Anand said. "Let them," Sarah replied. "Signal all ships, hold position, tend the wounded, and get ready. This isn't over. It's barely started." In the medical bay of the Kestrel, the cost of that first hour was becoming clear. 2 fighters had come back too badly damaged to save, though both pilots had ejected in time. A third pilot, a young woman named Corporal Mills, had a broken arm from a hard landing on the flight deck, and was arguing with the medic about being sent right back out. "I can still fly with one arm," Mills insisted. "You can still argue with one arm too, apparently," the medic said, strapping a brace around it anyway. "Sit down before I have security carry you down." Mills sat, grumbling, but there was no real anger in it. Down the row of cots, another pilot laughed at the exchange, and for a moment, the medical bay sounded less like the aftermath of a battle, and more like a rowdy kitchen at the end of a long shift. It was a strange thing, that laughter, and it would have looked stranger still to anyone who did not understand where it came from. Humans had learned, over thousands of years of hardship, that fear left unspoken curdled into something worse, and that a little dark humor in the middle of danger was often the only thing keeping a person's hands steady enough to keep working. On the bridge, Sarah caught snippets of the same mood among her bridge crew. Quiet jokes, a shared look between two officers who had grown up on the same colony, someone humming an old tune under their breath while they recalibrated a targeting array. She did not discourage it. She had learned long ago that soldiers who could still laugh in the middle of a fight were soldiers who had not yet been broken by it, and she needed every one of them unbroken for what was still coming. Anand approached her station with an updated report. Repair crews say we can have groups 4 and 7 combat ready again within 6 hours. The Krath fleet hasn't moved from its new formation. Looks like they're waiting. Waiting for what? Reinforcements, probably. Or orders. Either way, they didn't expect this, and it's slowing them down while they figure out what to do about us. Sarah studied the tactical display for a long moment, watching the dark cluster of Krath ships hanging in a tight, cautious knot above the burning planet. 4 hours ago, that same fleet had been carving through Vesa Prime cities without a hint of hesitation. Now it sat still, watching, clearly rattled by an enemy that did not fight the way the rest of the galaxy had trained it to expect. Good, she said quietly. Let them be rattled. Rattled enemies make mistakes. She turned back to the viewport, where the curve of Vesa Prime hung against the dark, its night side still scarred with fire, but no longer growing worse by the minute. Somewhere down there, an entire species was watching the sky, waiting to see what kind of ally had answered their call. Sarah did not know yet how the Allos would react to what they were about to meet. She only knew that whatever fear or wonder waited for her fleet on the surface, it could not be worse than the alternative of doing nothing at all. Anand, she said, prep a shuttle. Once the fleet's stable, I want to go down and talk to whoever's leading the people on that planet, face to face. Yes, Commander. Below them, the fires of Vesa Prime still burned, but for the first time in 2 days, they were no longer burning alone. The shuttle came down through smoke-streaked clouds and landed in the courtyard of the Allos capital's central shelter, its engines kicking up dust and ash that had settled over everything in the 2 days since the invasion began. Speaker Nell Tariq walked out to meet it herself, flanked by Asen and a handful of guards who carried weapons they barely knew how to use. The ramp lowered. Sarah Voss stepped out first, in a plain uniform, unarmed, her boots crunching on ash-covered stone. Behind her came 2 soldiers, also unarmed, though Nell Tariq noticed the careful, watchful way they moved, scanning the rooftops and the tree line even without weapons in their hands. It was a small thing, but it told her something. These were people who never fully stopped being ready for danger, even when they had chosen to walk in peace. Speaker Nell Tariq, Sarah said, inclining her head slightly. Her translator device rendered the words a half-second later in the soft, musical tones of the Allos language. I'm Fleet Commander Sarah Voss. We received your signal. Nell Tariq studied her for a long moment. Sarah was shorter than any Allos, built more solidly, with pale skin marked by a thin scar along one eyebrow, that Nell Tariq would later learn came from a childhood accident, not from war. There was nothing about her that looked particularly frightening, and yet something about the way she stood, still and alert, sent a small, ancient shiver down Nell Tariq's spine, the same instinct that might once have warned an Allos ancestor about a predator in the grass. You came, Nell Tariq said simply. We were told your people never leave your border, that the Great Assembly forbids it. They do, Sarah said. We came anyway. Why? Sarah looked past her, toward the shelter entrance, where dozens of Allos families huddled together, watching the strange newcomers with wide, frightened eyes. A child peered out from behind her mother's legs, her small gray hand clutching a scrap of fabric that might once have been a toy. Because you asked, Sarah said. That's usually enough for us. It was not the answer Nell Tariq expected. She had prepared herself for demands, for conditions, for the kind of careful political language every other ally in the galaxy used when offering help. Help that always seemed to come with strings attached. Instead, she got 4 words that carried no strings at all, and somehow that honesty was more unsettling than any negotiation could have been. Over the following hours, as human medical teams moved through the shelters treating the wounded, and engineers began assessing the damage to the city's defenses, Nell Tariq found herself watching the humans with a mixture of gratitude and growing unease. It was not that they were cruel. If anything, They were gentle with the wounded, patient with frightened children, careful not to touch anything that clearly held meaning to the grieving families around them. It was something else, something harder to name. She saw it first, in the medical shelter, where a human soldier named Sergeant Cole was helping carry supplies. An ALOS child, no older than 5, ran up to him laughing, delighted by his strange, tall shape, and tugged at his sleeve to show him a drawing she had made of the battle in the sky. Cole knelt down immediately, admiring the drawing with real warmth, making the little girl laugh again. And then, not 10 minutes later, Neltarik overheard the same soldier speaking quietly with another about the 4 crew members lost in that morning's fighting, his voice flat and steady, already planning how to hold the line if the Krath attacked again before nightfall. No tears, no visible grief, just calm, immediate calculation of what needed doing next. It was the gap between those 2 moments that unsettled her. The ALOS grieved slowly, openly, together. Watching a human move so easily from tenderness to grim readiness, without any visible transition between the two, felt like watching something that had learned to survive by never fully letting its guard down, even in the middle of kindness. "They are strange," Austin murmured to her that evening, as they watched a group of soldiers unloading crates of medical supplies while trading jokes and laughter, apparently unbothered by the ruined buildings around them. "How can they laugh, after everything we have both seen today?" Neltarik considered this for a long moment before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that laughing is how they keep from breaking. I do not think it means they feel nothing. I think it means they have learned to carry a great deal, and laughter is how they carry it without dropping it." She thought of the old records in the Concord archive, the ones that spoke of Earth, a world plagued by disease and violent weather, a species that had clawed its way through ice ages, famines, and constant warfare among itself before ever reaching the stars. The Great Assembly called humans unstable because of that history. Watching Sergeant Cole laugh with a child, and then coldly plan for a possible second attack in the same breath, Neltarik began to understand that unstable was the wrong word entirely. What she was watching was not instability. It was a species that had been forged, generation after generation, by a world that never once let them rest. Later that night, Sarah found Neltarik standing alone at the edge of the shelter's rooftop garden, looking up at the sky, where the 2 fleets still hung, in an uneasy stalemate. "May I ask you something, Commander?" Neltarik said without turning. "Of course. Your soldiers fought without fear today. They fought in ways that should not have worked, against ships far larger than your own, and they did it laughing. Even now, some of them are down in the shelters, telling jokes to children who watched their homes burn 2 days ago." She finally turned to face Sarah. "Are you always like this, even in the face of death?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Most of my crew grew up on colonies where the weather itself could kill you if you weren't careful, where a bad harvest meant real hunger, where a broken filtration system could take out an entire settlement in a night. We don't fear death the way I think your people do, Speaker. Not because we don't value life, because we've never had the luxury of pretending it was guaranteed. That sounds like a hard way to live." "It is," Sarah admitted. "But it also means that when someone asks for help, we don't have to think very hard about whether to give it. We already know what it costs to be left alone when everything is falling apart. We're not going to do that to someone else if we can help it." Neltarik looked at her for a long moment, and something in her ancient, wary instinct finally settled, not into comfort exactly, but into something close to trust. "The Great Assembly fears what your people might become," she said. "I begin to understand why, but I no longer think they are right to fear it." "Give it time," Sarah said, with a faint, tired smile, looking up at the dark shapes of the waiting Krath fleet. "The Krath haven't seen what we become when we're actually angry yet, neither have you." Far above the rooftop garden, where Sarah and Neltarik stood talking, aboard the flagship of the Krath Dominion fleet, Warlord Drez Khan was holding a very different kind of conversation. His command chamber was tense, filled with officers who had spent the last several hours reviewing the wreckage of their own ships and trying to explain how a fleet of 22 unremarkable vessels had managed to disable 4 of the Dominion's finest cruisers in under an hour. "Show me the pattern again," Drez Khan ordered, and the holographic display above the table replayed the battle, the strange scattering formation of the human fleet, the way small craft darted in and out of range, with a recklessness that should have gotten every one of them killed, and somehow had not. "They fight without discipline," one officer offered. "It should not work. Our simulations say it should not work. And yet 4 of our ships are drifting scrap," Dreskan said coldly. "Simulations are only useful when the enemy behaves the way you expect them to. This one does not." Vex stepped forward. "Warlord, intelligence suggests this is a quarantine species, considered a minor threat, restricted to their own sector by the wider galactic community, for their own protection as much as anyone else's. If they are willing to break that quarantine to defend a species they have no formal alliance with, it suggests they are exactly as dangerous as the rumors claimed," Dreskan finished. He studied the display for a long moment, his expression unreadable. 11 systems conquered, and never once had he faced an enemy that responded to overwhelming force with anything other than surrender or slow, hopeless resistance. This was new. He did not like new. "Options," he said. "We could withdraw," Vex offered carefully. "Reassess. Return with a larger force, better prepared for their tactics." Dreskan's expression darkened. Withdraw from a handful of unremarkable ships defending a planet of farmers and poets? No. That would be an admission that a minor species frightened the Dominion into retreat. "I will not carry that shame back to the High Command." He turned to the display, watching the fires still burning across the surface of Vesa Prime. "We escalate. If these humans came here believing they could save this world through clever tricks and small victories, we will show them exactly what happens to worlds that resist us. We will make an example so severe that even their reckless courage will not be able to withstand it." Vex hesitated. "Warlord, if we strike the remaining civilian centers directly, the humans may do many things," Dreskan interrupted. "But dead worlds do not fight back, and frightened allies do not stay allies for long. Prepare the fleet. At dawn, we remind everyone watching exactly why the Krath Dominion has never lost a conquest." He did not know, as he gave the order, that he was about to make the single greatest mistake of his long and brutal career. He did not know that somewhere below, on a rooftop garden overlooking a city he intended to burn to the ground, a human commander had already promised an alien speaker that the Krath had not yet seen what humans became when they were truly angry. He was about to find out. Dawn on Vesa Prime came the color of rust, the sun struggling to break through smoke that still hung over the coastline. Sarah Voss was already on the bridge of the Kestrel when the sensors picked up movement in the Krath fleet, dozens of ships shifting formation, engines flaring bright as they began to reposition. "Commander," Anand said, "the Krath fleet is moving. Looks like they're repositioning for a full assault, not another cautious probe like yesterday." Sarah studied the display. The Krath formation had changed overnight. Tighter, more aggressive, clearly built around a single overwhelming push, rather than the slow siege tactics they had used before. "They didn't like getting bloodied yesterday," she said. "This is them trying to end it fast." "Orders?" Sarah thought of the conversation with Nel Tarek the night before, of the little girl with the drawing, of Sergeant Cole's quiet, steady calculation in the middle of grief. She thought of 600 pages of treaty, telling her exactly how far outside the rules she already was, and decided it did not matter anymore. "Full fleet, launch," she said. "We're not letting them anywhere near that planet's surface. Anand, get me a channel to ground command. I want civilian shelters reinforced, and every remaining defense grid online, just in case anything gets through." The battle that followed would later be studied for years by military academies across a dozen species, though few of them would ever fully understand what they were looking at. The Krath fleet came in, exactly as their doctrine demanded, a slow, overwhelming wall of firepower designed to crush anything in its path through sheer weight of numbers and armor. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly across 11 conquered systems. Every enemy the Dominion had ever faced had responded to that wall the same way, by forming their own wall and trying to match it, or by scattering in panic and being picked off one by one. The human fleet did neither. Sarah's ships broke into small, independent groups the moment the Krath advance began, exactly as they had the day before, but this time with a difference that Dreskan's officers did not catch until it was too late. Several of the human vessels were not warships at all. They were converted cargo haulers and mining vessels, hastily fitted with makeshift weapons and armor plating. Ships that no sane commander would have sent into a real battle. They moved erratically, sometimes appearing to malfunction, drifting toward the heart of the Krath formation as though wounded and helpless. 2 of their ships are drifting into our formation, Vex reported to Drezkan. Damaged, likely. Shall we finish them? Let them come, Drezkan said, watching the crippled-looking ships drift closer. Easy kills. Don't waste heavy weapons on them. It was, Vex would later realize, exactly the mistake the humans had been counting on. The 2 damaged ships were not damaged at all. They were bait, packed nearly to bursting with reactor cores stripped from decommissioned vessels back on Earth, rigged by a team of engineers who had spent the entire previous night working without sleep on an idea one of them had scribbled on a napkin. If the enemy trusted their armor to survive anything, the answer was not to out-armor them, but to make them walk their own armor directly into a bomb. When the 2 ships detonated in the heart of the Krath formation, the explosion tore through 6 warships at once. Armor plating meant to withstand sustained bombardment, failing instantly against a blast designed and delivered from the inside. The Krath fleet, which had entered the engagement in tight, disciplined formation, was thrown into sudden chaos, ships scattering to avoid debris and secondary explosions, their carefully planned wall of firepower broken apart in seconds. That was the opening the rest of the human fleet had been waiting for. Now, Sarah said, and Anand relayed the order across the fleet. What followed was not a battle by any definition the Krath understood. Human fighters darted through the broken formation, striking weak points in Krath armor that intelligence teams had identified from the wreckage of the previous day's fight. Joints in the hull plating, exposed engine ports, sensor arrays left unprotected, because no previous enemy had ever been precise or reckless enough to target them directly. Some human pilots flew maneuvers that, by any reasonable calculation, should have gotten them killed, diving directly toward Krath cruisers before pulling away at the last possible second, using the larger ship's own bulk as cover from return fire. This is insane, Vex said, watching his own fleet unravel on the display in front of him. They fight like they have nothing to lose. They fight like predators who have never once had the luxury of being the biggest thing in the room, Drezkan muttered, his earlier confidence curdling into something closer to alarm. Bring the flagship's main batteries to bear. Target their command vessel directly, cut off the head, and the rest will scatter. The Kestrel took the brunt of that decision less than 10 minutes later, the flagship's shields flaring bright as concentrated fire from 3 Krath cruisers converged on it at once. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring across the bridge. Shields at 40%, Anand called out. They've locked onto us directly, Commander. Then let's give them a reason to regret it, Sarah said. Diaz, hard burn, bearing 270, now. Anand, signal groups 2 and 5, converge on those 3 cruisers the moment we clear their firing arc. The Kestrel dove, engines screaming, cutting a tight arc that put the ship dangerously close to a Krath cruiser's hull, close enough that the larger ship's own weapons could not track fast enough to keep firing without risking a collision. It was the kind of maneuver that existed on no official human tactical doctrine, the kind of move a pilot might attempt, only because some ancient, half-forgotten survival instinct told them that getting close to a predator's teeth was sometimes safer than trying to outrun them. It worked. The 3 cruisers hesitated, breaking formation to avoid the Kestrel's reckless dive, and in that half-second of hesitation, groups 2 and 5 arrived exactly where Sarah had called them, weapons already locked, striking the cruiser's undefended flanks before they could recover. By the time the sun fully broke over the smoke-covered horizon of Vesa Prime, the Krath assault had collapsed entirely. 11 ships destroyed or disabled. The rest pulled back in a retreat so hurried, it barely resembled a formation at all. Drezkan's command vessel among them, its hull scorched, and one of its engines trailing smoke. On the bridge of the Kestrel, Sarah allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to breathe before turning back to her station. Casualties? 2 ships lost, 12 wounded, no confirmed deaths yet, Anand reported, relief evident in her voice despite the exhaustion. Commander, that's a real victory. We broke their assault completely. Sarah nodded slowly, watching the retreating Krath fleet on the display. and felt none of the satisfaction she thought she might. She thought instead of the conversation with Nel Tarek, of the warning she had given without fully meaning to give it. The Krath had come in with overwhelming force and arrogant certainty, and humanity had answered with creativity, sacrifice, and a willingness to bleed that no simulation could have predicted. But she also knew, with the certainty of someone who had read enough history to recognize a pattern, that a wounded predator rarely simply walked away. It regrouped. It grew angrier. And sometimes, in its fury, it did something far worse than anything it had tried before. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "And next time, I don't think they'll be careful about who gets caught in the middle." On the surface of Vesa Prime, Nel Tarek had watched the battle from the shelter's rooftop garden, unable to look away even as Asen begged her to come below where it was safer. She had seen the two small ships drift toward the heart of the Krath formation, and had not understood, not until the flash lit up the sky brighter than the rising sun, exactly what she had witnessed. "They destroyed their own ships," she said, stunned, once the light had faded and the chaos of the battle had begun to unfold above them. "On purpose, to open a gap." "Sacrifice," Asen murmured beside her. "I read that word in the old human histories the Concord archive keeps. I never understood what it meant, not really. I think I do now." Nel Tarek said nothing for a long while, watching human fighters weave between the much larger Krath cruisers, striking and vanishing, refusing every rule of engagement the Alos had ever studied. When the Krath fleet finally broke and fled toward the edge of the system, a ragged cheer went up from the shelter behind her, dozens of Alos voices rising together in relief, so sudden and so total that several of them wept openly, clutching each other in the doorway. Nel Tarek did not cheer. She stood very still, watching the retreating enemy ships shrink into the dark, and felt the same unsettled feeling from the night before return, stronger now. The humans had won. They had saved her world, at least for today. But they had won by treating their own lives as tools to be spent, by embracing risks that no Alos strategist would ever have considered acceptable, and by doing all of it with a calm, practiced ease that suggested this was simply how humans solved problems when the stakes were high enough. She thought of what Sarah had told her the night before, that humans did not fear death the way the Alos did, because they had never had the luxury of pretending life was guaranteed. Watching the wreckage of 6 Krath warships drift silently in high orbit, Nel Tarek began to understand, with a clarity that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her, exactly what kind of debt her people had just incurred, and exactly what kind of allies had chosen to answer their call. Later that day, when Sarah returned to the surface to check on the shelters, Nel Tarek met her at the landing pad, this time without guards, without ceremony, just the two of them standing in the ash-streaked courtyard. "You destroyed 2 of your own ships to win that battle," Nel Tarek said quietly. "We did," Sarah confirmed. "Was anyone aboard them?" "No. We evacuated the crews before we sent them in. It wasn't a suicide run, Speaker. It was a trick." Sarah paused, studying the alien's careful expression. "You look troubled." "I am trying to understand what kind of species does what your people did today, and calls it merely a trick," Nel Tarek said. The burrito was cold. Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. The kind of species that grew up learning that sometimes the only way to survive something bigger and stronger than you is to make it underestimate you, and then make it pay for that mistake. "We didn't invent that today, Speaker. We've been doing it since before we ever left our own world." Nel Tarek looked past her, toward the horizon where the wreckage of the Krath assault still burned faint trails of smoke into the sky, and said nothing more. She was beginning to understand that the war was not over, that the enemy above them was wounded and furious, and far from finished, and that the very qualities that had saved her people today were the same qualities the Great Assembly had spent a century warning the galaxy to fear. She was right to worry. Aboard his damaged flagship, retreating to the edge of the system to regroup, Warlord Drez Khan was already giving orders that would turn this war from a battle for territory into something far darker. Warlord Drez Khan stood in the scorched command chamber of his flagship, one hand pressed against the wall to steady himself as damage crews worked to restore power to half the ship's systems. 11 ships lost or crippled. A retreat that would be reported back to the High Command, whether he wished it or not. In 11 conquered systems, nothing like this had ever happened to him. Options, he said again, the same word he had used the night before, though his voice now carried none of its earlier calm. Vex hesitated before speaking. He had learned, over years of service, to read the warlord's moods, and this one was dangerous. We could withdraw entirely, Warlord. Report to High Command that Vesa Prime is defended by an unknown hostile force and request reinforcement before. No. Drezkon's voice was flat and final. I will not carry news of a retreat back to High Command. Not because of farmers, poets, and a handful of reckless outsiders. He turned to the display, still showing the wreckage of his fleet, drifting in high orbit. If we cannot break them through strength, we will break them through fear. Warlord, the humans came here to protect the Alos. That is their weakness. They value these creatures, this alliance, more than sense allows. If we cannot defeat the humans directly, we remove their reason for fighting. We show them, and every ally watching from the shadows of this war, exactly what happens to worlds that accept help from outsiders. Vex went very still. You mean to strike the shelters directly, the civilian population? I mean to end this quickly, Drezkon said. One severe lesson now saves 100 battles later. Every world watching this conflict will learn that resistance and rescue only make the punishment worse. Prepare a strike on the largest shelter complex in the capital, at dusk. Vex did not argue further, though something in his expression suggested he understood, even then, that this order would not accomplish what his commander believed it would. The attack came just as the sun began to set over Vesa Prime, a single Krath cruiser breaking from the retreating fleet and diving low over the capital before the human defense grid could fully react. It struck not a military target, but the largest civilian shelter in the city, the same shelter where Nel Tarek had spoken with the frightened old man 2 nights before, where children had slept in their parents' arms through the sound of distant bombing, where Sergeant Cole had knelt to admire a small girl's drawing of a battle in the sky. The shelter's outer defenses held just long enough for most of the families inside to reach the deeper levels, but the strike still tore through the upper floors, collapsing walls, killing dozens who had not made it to safety in time, wounding many more. Among the dead was the old man who had asked Nel Tarek 2 nights before whether anyone out there cared what happened to his people. Word reached the Kestrel within minutes. Sarah Voss stood on the bridge, listening to the report from Ground Command, her expression growing colder with every detail. Anand, watching her, recognized something in that stillness that unsettled her more than any amount of shouting could have. Commander, Anand said carefully. Orders. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing at all. She was thinking of the old man, whom she had never met, but had heard described in Nel Tarek's careful, grieving voice not an hour before. She was thinking of the little girl with the drawing, praying without letting herself hope too hard that the child had been among those who made it to the deeper shelter in time. She was thinking of every briefing she had ever sat through about restraint, proportional response, and the careful diplomatic language the Joint Colonial Defense Council would use to describe whatever she chose to do next. She set all of it aside. Ready every ship, she said, her voice quiet and utterly steady. We are not defending this world anymore. We are ending this war. What followed was not the same careful, clever fighting that had won the 2 previous engagements. It was something older, something that had been sitting coiled and patient beneath the discipline of human military doctrine since the very first war humanity had ever fought against itself, back when the stakes were simply survival and there had been no rules at all. The human fleet did not scatter into small, evasive groups this time. It came together, forming a single, driving spear aimed directly at the heart of the retreating Krath formation, moving with a speed and coordination that no simulation in Krath databases had ever accounted for. Sarah did not call for clever tricks or careful sacrifice plays. She called for annihilation, target after target, weak point after weak point, identified from 2 days of hard-won data. No hesitation, no mercy. No pause to consider anything but the fastest possible path to ending the threat entirely. Their formation is breaking, Anand reported, her voice tight with something between awe and unease as she watched the tactical display. Commander, they're trying to retreat completely, not regroup. They're running. Cut off their escape vectors, Sarah said. All of them. Commander, if we corner them entirely, they'll have no choice but to fight to the last ship. Our own losses could be— I am aware of the cost, Lieutenant, Sarah said, and something in her voice made Anand fall silent immediately. They chose this. They struck a shelter full of children to send us a message. We are going to send one back. Down on the surface, Nell Tarek stood in the wreckage of the shelter's upper floor, helping search teams pull survivors from the rubble, her hands raw and bleeding from clearing debris alongside soldiers and volunteers alike. She had not slept in almost 2 full days. When word reached her that the human fleet had launched a full offensive against the retreating Krath, she felt no relief, only a heavy, exhausted dread, uncertain whether she was about to witness salvation or something far more terrible. She found out an hour later, standing on the same rooftop where she had spoken with Sarah twice before, watching streaks of light tear across the darkening sky as the human fleet ran the Krath formation to ground at the edge of the system. There was no elegance to this battle. None of the careful, almost artistic maneuvering of the previous fight. This was simply overwhelming, relentless pressure, ship after Krath ship destroyed in quick succession, the human fleet pressing forward without pause, without retreat, without anything that resembled restraint. This is different, Austin said quietly beside her, his voice trembling slightly. This is not the same as before. No, Nell Tarek agreed. Before, they were protecting us. Now they are punishing them. She thought of the words Sarah had said to her on the first night, an answer that had seemed almost gentle at the time. Let them be afraid. Better afraid of us than dead because of someone else. Standing in the wreckage of a shelter that had held sleeping children only hours before, Nell Tarek finally understood the full weight of that sentence. And for the first time since the humans had arrived, she felt real fear alongside her gratitude. Not fear of the enemy overhead, but fear of exactly what her rescuers were capable of becoming when something they valued was taken from them. Above the system, aboard his flagship, Warlord Drez Khan watched his fleet collapse around him and understood, far too late, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had believed that striking the shelter would break the humans' resolve, would remind them that this was not their war to fight, that the cost of continued involvement would only grow worse. Instead, he had done the one thing no galactic strategist should ever do to an enemy species, born from a world that had spent its entire history refusing to accept defeat. He had given them a reason to stop holding back. Inside the medical shelter, in a lower level that had held against the strike, a young human medic named Private On worked through the night alongside Alos healers, treating wounds neither species had fully studied in the other. It was slow, careful work, made harder by grief that neither side had time yet to properly feel. At one point, On found herself kneeling beside a small Alos boy with a shard of debris embedded in his leg, holding his hand, while an Alos healer worked, murmuring reassurances in a language he could not understand, but seemed to find comfort in anyway, simply from the tone. "You will be all right," she told him, over and over, though she had no way to know for certain if it was true. "You will be all right." Nearby, Sergeant Cole worked with a search team, clearing a final collapsed corridor, and it was his voice, hoarse and strained, that eventually called out that they had found the little girl who had shown him her drawing 2 days before, alive, frightened, and covered in dust, but breathing. The relief that swept through the shelter at that moment was so sudden and so total that even the exhausted volunteers, who had been working in grim, silent focus for hours, found themselves briefly, unexpectedly close to tears. It was that same girl, wrapped in a blanket and finally reunited with her mother, who Nell Tarek found herself thinking of hours later, as she watched the distant flashes of the fleet battle continue at the edge of the system. She held on to that image deliberately, that one small act of survival amid so much loss, because it was the only thing that let her look up at the terrible, overwhelming fury unfolding in the sky above her, and still believe, somewhere underneath the fear, that the ones delivering it had not lost themselves entirely to it. She did not yet know if she was right. She would not know for certain, until the battle above her finally, fully ended. By the 3rd day of the war, the fighting had moved to the edge of the Vesa system, far enough from the planet that its people could no longer watch the battle directly. only track its progress through anxious reports relayed from the human fleet. Nell Tarek spent most of that day in the shelter's makeshift command room, listening to updates alongside Austin and a small group of Concord officials who had, only a week earlier, never expected to need a command room at all. What she heard did not sound like the wild, overwhelming fury of the night the shelter had been struck. It sounded, instead, like something far more deliberate. "They've stopped simply attacking," Austin said, studying the reports with visible confusion. "Look at this. Human ships are targeting the Krath supply convoys first, cutting off their fuel and munitions before engaging their combat vessels directly. And this, they're broadcasting captured communications back into Krath channels, mixed with recordings of their own commander's voice. What is that supposed to accomplish?" Nell Tarek studied the reports herself, and slowly, a picture began to form that eased some of the dread she had carried since the shelter attack. "I think," she said, "they are trying to break the Krath's will to fight, not simply their ability to fight. There is a difference." Aboard the Kestrel, that difference was very much intentional. Sarah Voss stood over the tactical table with Anand and her senior officers, the fury of the previous night's engagement, now channeled into something colder and far more calculated. "We could have run them all the way to the edge of the system and finished it in one more push," Anand said. "Why the change in approach, Commander?" "Because finishing it in one more push means a lot more of our people die, alongside a lot more of theirs. And because a broken enemy who still believes in his cause will keep sending more ships after this one," Sarah said. "I want the Krath soldiers on those ships to start asking themselves why they're fighting a war their own commander is losing so badly. Fear beats a fleet. Doubt beats an empire." It was a lesson, Anand realized as she listened, that did not come from any tactics manual either of them had studied. It came from somewhere older, from the long, brutal history of a species that had learned, across 1,000 conflicts on its own homeworld, that the deadliest weapon was rarely the biggest gun. It was making an enemy stop believing the fight was worth continuing. Over the following 2 days, the human fleet applied that lesson with a precision that unsettled even Nell Tarek, watching from a careful distance. They struck supply lines, cutting the Krath fleet off from resupply and reinforcement. They intercepted and rebroadcast Krath communications, letting ordinary soldiers hear their own commanders' increasingly desperate reports back to a high command that was growing openly critical of his handling of what should have been an easy conquest. They allowed damaged Krath vessels to retreat rather than destroying them outright, letting word spread through the wider Dominion fleet of an enemy that fought with terrifying skill but did not seem interested in senseless slaughter once resistance had clearly broken. "It's psychological warfare," Nell Tarek said to Sarah during one of their now regular meetings in the shelter's rooftop garden. "You are trying to defeat their spirit, not merely their fleet." "A fleet without spirit isn't a fleet anymore," Sarah said. "It's just a target list waiting to happen. I'd rather end this by breaking their will to keep fighting than by killing every last one of them. Fewer good people on either side die that way." Nell Tarek studied her carefully. "That surprises me, Commander." "After the shelter." Sarah's expression tightened slightly, the only visible sign of the grief and fury she had carried since that night. "After the shelter, I wanted to end every Krath ship in that fleet without a second thought. I still do. Some part of me. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that would prove every fear the Great Assembly has about my species. I didn't come out here to become the thing we're fighting, Speaker. I came to protect people who needed protecting. Sometimes that means holding back fury I'd rather not hold back at all." It was a distinction Nell Tarek had not expected to hear, and one that finally began to settle the deep unease she had carried since watching the human fleet unleash itself at the edge of the system. What she was witnessing was not a species with no limits, no matter how fierce its response had been. It was a species that had chosen, deliberately and with visible effort, to place limits on itself, even in the middle of righteous anger, which struck her as a far harder thing to manage than simply having no anger to control in the first place. Aboard the Krath flagship, the effects of the human strategy were becoming impossible to ignore. Vex approached Drez Khan on the 4th day of the campaign with a report he clearly did not want to deliver. "Warlord, 3 ship captains have requested permission to withdraw their vessels from the engagement, citing critical supply shortages. 2 more have stopped responding to command hails entirely. Crew morale across the fleet is—" He hesitated. "It is failing, Warlord. Soldiers are asking why we continue a war against an enemy who has already shown they could destroy us outright, and instead seem to be waiting for us to simply give up." Drez Khan said nothing for a long moment, staring at the tactical display, at the slow, grinding erosion of a fleet that had once seemed unstoppable. He thought of 11 easy conquests, of a career built on the certainty that overwhelming force always won in the end. He had never faced an enemy that fought this way before, brutal when provoked, but disciplined enough to pull that brutality back the moment it had served its purpose, patient enough to let fear and doubt do the rest of the work. "Send word to High Command," he said finally, his voice heavy with something that had not been there 4 days earlier. "Tell them Vesa Prime is not the easy conquest it was reported to be. Tell them we require reinforcement, or we require permission to withdraw." Vex hesitated. "And if High Command grants neither?" Drez Khan looked at the display for a long time before answering. "Then I suspect we are about to learn exactly how this war ends, whether we choose the manner of it or not." Far below, on the surface of Vesa Prime, Nell Tarek received word of the growing cracks in the Krath fleet with something she had not felt in nearly a week. Real, solid hope. Not the desperate, fragile kind she had carried since sending the beacon, but something steadier, built on the growing understanding that the allies who had answered her call were fierce enough to win this war, and disciplined enough not to lose themselves in doing it. "They are close to breaking," she told Austin that evening, watching the latest reports scroll past. "Not just their fleet, their spirit." "Do you think Commander Voss's people will finish it?" Austin asked. Nell Tarek thought of the rooftop garden, of Sarah's careful, deliberate restraint even in the shadow of grief. "I think," she said, "they will finish it exactly as thoroughly as it needs to be finished, and not one measure more than that. I am beginning to believe that is precisely what makes them the allies we needed, and precisely what the rest of the galaxy has never understood about them." Aboard the Kestrel, Sarah allowed herself a rare hour of rest on the evening of the 4th day, though rest for her had come to mean simply sitting quietly in her quarters rather than sleeping, staring at reports she had already read twice. Anand found her there, bringing an update she thought the commander would want immediately. "High Command intercepts confirm it, Commander," Anand said. "The Krath Dominion is debating whether to reinforce this campaign or abandon it. Some voices in their command structure are already calling Vesa Prime a lost cause, not worth the cost." Sarah nodded slowly, though the news brought her less relief than Anand seemed to expect. "That's good. That's what we wanted. But Drez Khan isn't the kind of commander who walks away quietly, Lieutenant. I've read enough about men like him. When someone like that feels his career slipping away, he doesn't retreat gracefully. He does something desperate, something meant to salvage his reputation, even if it costs him everything else. You think he'll try something drastic before High Command can order a withdrawal? I think a wounded, humiliated commander, who has already shown he's willing to strike civilians once his first plan failed, is exactly the kind of enemy who tries something even worse the second time," Sarah said. "I want every ship ready for anything. No celebrations yet, not until this is actually finished." Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of studying exactly the kind of desperate, cornered aggression that history's worst conflicts had always produced in their final stages, would prove painfully accurate. Drez Khan was not a man who accepted defeat easily, and the coming confrontation would test not only the human fleet's strength, but the very restraint Sarah had worked so hard to maintain throughout the campaign. Above the system, the final pieces of Drez Khan's once unstoppable fleet continued to erode, ship by ship, soldier by soldier, doubt by doubt, until only one confrontation remained, to decide how this war, and the fate of the Krath Dominion's ambitions in this region of space, would finally come to an end. Sarah's instincts proved right within a day. Rather than wait for High Command's decision, Drez Khan gathered what remained of his fleet, now barely half its original strength, and prepared for one final, all-or-nothing assault. He had lost 11 ships in the first 2 engagements, and lost more since, to desertion and damage he could not repair in the field, but he still commanded enough firepower, if used correctly, to do serious damage before the end. If he could not win this war, he decided, he would at least make certain the cost of winning it broke something in his enemy that could never be repaired. His plan was simple and brutal. Rather than engage the human fleet directly again, he would send his remaining warships in a single desperate run, aimed not at the Kestrel or any military target, but directly at Vesa Prime's capital, its shelters, its remaining infrastructure, a final act of destruction, meant to ensure that even in defeat, the Krath Dominion left behind nothing worth protecting. Sarah received the warning less than an hour before the assault began, relayed through a Krath communication her own fleet had intercepted and decoded, a farewell transmission Drez Khan sent to his high command that her intelligence officers happened to catch before it finished transmitting. "He's not trying to win anymore," Anand said, reading the decoded message aloud on the bridge, her voice tight with alarm. "He's trying to make sure that if he loses, he takes the planet down with him." Sarah felt something in her chest go very cold and very still, the same feeling she had carried the night the shelter was struck, except sharper now, more focused. "Fleet-wide alert," she said. "All ships, defensive formation around Vesa Prime, immediately. Ground command, get every remaining shelter reinforced and sealed. This is it." The final battle for Vesa Prime began less than 30 minutes later, and it was unlike anything that had come before it. Drez Khan's remaining ships did not attempt clever tactics or careful formations. They simply drove forward, every remaining vessel aimed like a spear directly at the planet below, weapons firing continuously, accepting whatever losses came in exchange for even a single ship making it through to strike the surface. Sarah's fleet met them head-on, forming a defensive wall between the incoming Krath assault and the planet they had come to protect. It was, in many ways, the opposite of every tactic that had won the previous battles. No scattering, no clever misdirection. Simply a solid, unbreakable line of human ships, absorbing everything the desperate Krath assault could throw at them. "Shields failing on 3 vessels, Anand called out. "Commander, if we hold this formation, we're going to take heavy losses." "Hold it anyway," Sarah said. "Every ship that gets through this line is a ship that reaches that planet. We hold." On the surface, Neltarik stood in the deepest level of the shelter, surrounded by families who had already survived one attack on this very complex, watching the battle unfold on emergency displays relayed from the human fleet. She did not look away this time, even as ship after ship, human and Krath alike, flared and died in the dark sky above her world. "They are not moving," she said quietly, watching the human formation hold its position against the overwhelming Krath charge. They could break formation, scatter, like before. Instead, they are simply absorbing it. "They are protecting us," Austin said, his voice hushed, directly. "With their bodies, if it comes to that." It very nearly did. 3 human vessels were lost in the first 20 minutes of the assault, their crews evacuating where possible. Their wrecks folded into the defensive line to serve as one final obstacle for the incoming Krath ships to navigate around. Sarah watched each loss on her display with an expression that gave away nothing to her crew, though the cost of every decision she made in those minutes would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was Drez Khan's own flagship, driving directly for the center of the human formation in a final, desperate push that finally broke the assault entirely. Sarah, watching the enemy commander's vessel bear down on the weakest point in her line, made the same kind of calculated, reckless decision that had defined every previous victory of this war. "Diaz, take us directly into their path," she ordered. "Full power to forward shields." "Commander, that's their flagship, full weapons power." "I know what it is, Lieutenant. Do it." The Kestrel moved to intercept Drez Khan's flagship directly, absorbing a punishing exchange of fire at point-blank range that left both ships badly damaged within minutes. It was not a clever maneuver. It was simply 2 commanders, each unwilling to yield, meeting each other head-on in the final moments of a war that had already cost both sides more than either had expected. It was Vex, watching his warlords' increasingly erratic orders from the flagship's secondary command station, who finally made the decision that ended the battle. As the Kestrel's counterattack tore through the flagship's failing shields, Vex overrode Drez Khan's continued demand to press the attack, and instead ordered an immediate, full retreat of every remaining Krath vessel, broadcasting the order across every channel before the warlord could countermand it. "What are you doing?" Drez Khan demanded, staggering as another impact rocked the bridge. "Ending this before there is nothing left of our fleet to bring home," Vex said. You would have every soldier on this ship die for a conquest that was lost 4 days ago, warlord. I will not allow that. Drez Khan opened his mouth to argue, but the flagship systems chose that moment to fail entirely, plunging half the bridge into darkness and forcing even the warlord to accept, in the sudden emergency of a dying ship, that the war was over, whether he willed it or not. The retreat that followed was as chaotic as the assault had been desperate, the surviving Krath vessels scattering away from Vesa Prime in every direction, no longer a fleet in any organized sense, simply a collection of ships fleeing an engagement they had lost far more thoroughly than any of them wanted to admit. Sarah watched them go from the battered bridge of the Kestrel, smoke curling from a ruptured conduit somewhere behind her, and allowed herself, finally, a long, unsteady breath. "Confirm status of all ships," she said. "And somebody get me a full casualty report. I want to know exactly what this cost us." The cost, when the final numbers came in over the following hours, was heavy. 6 ships lost entirely, dozens of wounded, and a list of names that Sarah would carry with her, long after the celebrations on the surface had faded. But Vesa Prime still stood. Its shelters, though scarred, still held every family that had sought refuge within them. And somewhere in the wreckage scattered across the system, a warlord who had once conquered 11 systems without ever facing real resistance, limped away from the 12th, forced for the first time in his long, brutal career to accept a defeat he had never once believed possible. On the surface, as word of the retreat spread through the shelters, the reaction was not the wild, uncomplicated celebration that had followed the first victory days earlier. It was quieter, heavier, full of relief tangled together with grief, for everyone, human and Alos alike, who had not survived to see it. Nel Tarek stood at the edge of the crowd gathering in the shelter's central courtyard, watching families embrace, watching human soldiers set down their weapons for the first time in nearly a week, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not yet have a word for. Not quite peace, not quite triumph, but something close to both. Above her, the Kestrel held position in orbit, battered but intact, its crew already beginning the long, exhausted work of counting losses and tending wounds. Sarah found Nel Tarek in that courtyard as the evening wore on, still in her damaged uniform, a fresh cut above one eyebrow that would leave a small scar to match the older one already there. Neither of them said anything at first. They simply stood together, watching the crowd, listening to the strange mixture of laughter and quiet weeping that always followed a battle, finally, truly ending. "You held the line," Nel Tarek said eventually. "Even as your ships were destroyed one by one, you did not break formation, even when it would have cost you less to scatter." "Scattering would have meant some of their ships getting through to the surface," Sarah said. "We weren't going to let that happen while we still had ships left to stop it." 6 of your vessels, how many of your people?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. 41 confirmed dead. A dozen more still missing, though I don't hold much hope for them at this point. She looked out over the courtyard, at the families embracing, the children finally allowed to laugh, without watching the sky for danger. "It's a hard number to carry, Speaker. But I look at all of this, and I know exactly what it bought." Nel Tarek was quiet for a long moment. "My people did not ask you to pay that price." "No," Sarah agreed. "You just asked for help. The price was always going to be ours to decide, once we chose to answer." She managed a tired, faint smile. "That's usually how it works, when the answer is worth giving at all." Around them, the courtyard slowly filled with more survivors, human soldiers, and Alos families mixing together for the first time, without the shadow of battle hanging over them. Some trading halting words through translator devices, others simply sitting together in exhausted, grateful silence. It was an uneasy, imperfect kind of peace, built on grief as much as relief, but it was real, and after everything both species had survived to reach it, that was enough for one evening. The war for Vesa Prime was over. What came next, for both species, was something neither of them had fully prepared for. 3 weeks after the last Krath ship fled the Vesa system, the Alos Concord Council held a formal ceremony in the rebuilt central square of the capital, honoring the human fleet that had answered their call. It was a strange kind of ceremony, blending Alos traditions of gratitude, which involved long, formal speeches and the exchange of woven garlands, with the more practical, understated manner in which the humans preferred to receive thanks. Sarah Voss stood at the front of the gathered crowd in a clean, pressed uniform, feeling distinctly out of place amid the elegant Alos formality, as Speaker Nel Tarek addressed both her people and the assembled human soldiers. For 300 years, Nel Tarek said, her voice carrying clearly across the square, we told ourselves that peace was something a species could simply choose, and that choosing it was enough to keep it safe. We were wrong. Peace, we have learned, sometimes needs defenders, and defenders are not always gentle, not always comfortable to stand beside. But they were there when we called, and there is no debt in this galaxy greater than that. She turned to face Sarah directly. The Great Assembly has spent a century telling the rest of us that the human species is too dangerous to associate with, too unstable, too shaped by violence to be trusted. I confess that when I sent our distress call across the border into your space, I believed some of that myself. I was desperate enough to ask for help despite my fear, not because I had already set that fear aside. Sarah listened without interrupting, aware that every word was being recorded and would eventually make its way back to the Great Assembly, back to 100 worlds that had spent a century deciding what kind of species humanity was, without ever bothering to ask. I no longer believe what I was taught to believe, Nel Tarek continued. I have watched your soldiers laugh with grieving children and calculate battle strategy in the same breath. I have watched you destroy your own ships without hesitation to save a world you had never seen a week before. I have watched you hold a line against overwhelming odds, rather than let a single enemy vessel reach the families sheltering below you. And I have watched you choose, again and again, to place limits on your own fury, even when every reason in the galaxy would have excused you for abandoning them. She paused. You are not gentle, Commander Voss. But you are not what the Great Assembly claims either. I think the truth is simply that you are a species who has learned, through a harder history than most of us can imagine, exactly what it costs to need help and receive none. And you have chosen not to let anyone else learn that same lesson, while you have the power to prevent it. The formal alliance signed later that day, between the Alos Concord and the human colonial government, was modest in its terms. Mutual defense in the immediate region, shared intelligence regarding Krath Dominion movements, and the beginning of trade routes that would, over the following years, grow into something far larger than either side fully anticipated. But its true significance lay less in the words of the treaty and more in what it represented, the first crack in a century-old wall of fear and quarantine that had kept humanity isolated from the wider galaxy. News of the alliance spread quickly once the Alos representatives brought it before the Great Assembly, and the reaction was every bit as divided as Sarah had expected. Some delegates spoke with open alarm about the precedent being set, warning that other species might now expect the same reckless, uncontrolled intervention should they find themselves threatened. Others, more quietly, began reaching out through unofficial channels, curious what it might mean to have an ally like humanity on their side, rather than only fearing what might happen if humanity was ever provoked. Back on Vesa Prime, in the weeks that followed, a strange and gradual friendship began to take root between the two species, built not on grand ceremony, but on small, ordinary moments. Human engineers worked alongside Alos builders to reconstruct the damaged shelters, trading techniques neither side had considered before. Alos healers studied human medical practices with fascination, startled by treatments built around a species that had evolved to survive injuries far more severe than anything an Alos body was built to withstand. Children on both sides, as children always do, found ways to play together long before the adults fully worked out how to be comfortable around one another. It was in one such quiet moment, several weeks into the reconstruction effort, that a young Alos recruit named Tessin approached Sergeant Cole while he helped clear rubble from a half-rebuilt schoolhouse. Tessin was barely more than a child by human standards, newly enlisted in the small defense force the Concord had begun forming in the aftermath of the invasion, still uncertain and eager in the particular way of someone who has decided to become brave before fully understanding what that will cost. Sergeant, Tessin said, working up the courage over several minutes of silent labor beside him. May I ask you something? Sure, kid. Why did you come, truly? Your people had no treaty with us. No history. The Great Assembly forbade it, and you risked your lives, your ships, everything, for a world you had never even heard of, a week before we called. I do not understand why anyone would take that risk for strangers. Cole set down the piece of debris he had been carrying and considered the question for a long moment. The same kind of consideration Sarah had given Nell Tarek's questions weeks earlier, unhurried and honest. You know what it's like to be really scared, Cole said. Truly scared. Not worried about a bad harvest or an argument with a neighbor. Scared like you're about to lose everything, and there's nothing you can do about it alone. Tessin thought of the 2 nights spent in the shelter, the sound of Krath bombardment rolling across the hills, the old man's trembling question to Nell Tarek about whether anyone cared. Yes, he said quietly. I know that feeling. My people have known that feeling for a very long time, Cole said. Longer than most species in this galaxy, probably. Our homeworld didn't give us much of a break, ever. We learned early that when someone's drowning, you don't stand on the shore calculating the risk to yourself before deciding whether to jump in. You just jump, and you figure the rest out once you're already in the water. He picked the debris back up, hefting it onto his shoulder. We heard you drowning, kid. That's really all there was to it. Tessin said nothing for a while, working alongside him in silence, turning the answer over in his mind. It was not the grand, complicated explanation he had half expected, full of strategy and galactic politics. It was something simpler and, in its own way, harder to fully understand. An answer that suggested humanity's willingness to fight, to bleed, to hold a line against overwhelming odds, came not from some cold calculation of advantage, but from something closer to instinct, worn deep into the species by a history that had never once let them forget what it cost to be left alone in the dark. That evening, as the sun set over a city slowly rebuilding itself, Sarah Voss stood once more on the rooftop garden where she and Nell Tarek had first spoken, watching human and Allos work crews finish the day's repairs together below. The Kestrel would leave orbit within the week, returning home to face a joint Colonial Defense Council, still arguing, no doubt, about the political fallout of what she had done. She did not regret it. She was not certain she ever would. Nell Tarek joined her, as she often did now in these quiet evening hours, and for a while, neither of them spoke, simply watching the last light fade over a world that, against every expectation, still stood. The Great Assembly will not be pleased with what you have started here, Nell Tarek said eventually. No, Sarah agreed. They won't be. Do you regret it? Sarah thought of the little girl with the drawing, of the old man who had not survived to see the war's end, of the 41 names she now carried with her, and of a city that had been given the chance to rebuild because a distress call had reached the right ears at the right time. No, she said, I don't. Nell Tarek nodded slowly, understanding settling over her at last, complete and unafraid. Then I think, Commander Voss, that the galaxy is about to learn something it has spent a century refusing to understand about your people. What's that? That fury spent in defense of the innocent is not the same thing as instability, Nell Tarek said. It is simply love, wearing armor, and a galaxy that has forgotten how to recognize, that has forgotten something important about what it means to truly protect one another. Below them, the lights of the rebuilding city flickered on, one by one, against the darkening sky, human and Allos hands working side by side to raise them, and somewhere far beyond the edges of the Vesa system, word of what had happened there was already beginning to spread, not just the story of a battle won, but the story of a species the galaxy had feared for a century, and had never once truly understood, finally stepping out from behind its quarantine to answer a call for help with everything it had. They had been called for help, and they had answered with fury, the fierce, unyielding, protective fury of a species that had never learned how to watch someone suffer and do nothing at all. It would not be the last time the galaxy called on them, and it would not be the last time humanity answered.